Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to Texas Tech College of Architecture. I'm David Turturro, and it is my distinct privilege to introduce today's speaker, who will be giving the second lecture of our 2022-23 lecture series on the theme of resilience. Dr. Rosetta S. Elkin is the director of the new landscape architecture program at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York, and she is the founding principal of Practice Landscape, a collaborative design studio that prioritizes garden making, public exhibitions, ecological and horticultural research, and landscape architectural projects to promote a more thoughtful and accountable design agenda. Projects range in scale and include rural shorelines across Quebec, former agricultural lands outside Chicago, a barrier island formation in Cadiva, Florida, and lakeside residential in Minnesota. Elkin also co-launched Practice Grant, a nonprofit regranting organization committed to opening access and expanding approaches to landscape design. In its inaugural year, Practice Grant received over 65 vetted applications from 28 US states and 4 Canadian provinces. Elkin serves as research associate at Harvard's Arnold Arboretum, one of my favorite places on earth, where she conducts long-term analyses on the role of public space with a focus on expanding access to landscape-based opportunity across local and regional communities. As a designer and a scholar, her work experiments with the ways in which we compose our worlds, blurring the traditional boundaries between research and practice. Elkin elevates the role of plants in human life by exploring the concealed characteristics of non-human behavior. Elkin previously taught as associate professor at McGill University in Montreal and at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where she was co-director of the Master of Design Studies program in Risk and Resilience. Her work has received numerous awards, including the Graham Foundation Grant, Harvard Climate Solutions Award, and the Garden Club of American Rome Prize in Landscape Architecture, as well as German and Dutch funds for Kunst. Elkin's work has been exhibited and published widely in venues such as the Victoria and Albert Museum, Les Jardins de Métis, Chelsea Festival, and the Isabella Stewart Garden Museum, and in publications including Topos, Journal of Landscape Architecture, New Geographies, Harvard Design Magazine, and Arnoldia. Elkin is the author of Plant Life, The Entangled Politics of Afforestation, published just this year, a major contribution to the field, describing the geopolitical ambitions of tree planting programs. Elkin is also the author of Tiny Taxonomy of 2017, which reflects on the scale of individual plants through a reading of 3 garden installations. Her forthcoming book is a fieldwork-based portrait of climate adaptation around the world, entitled Landscapes of Retreat, being published in Berlin by K. Verlag as we speak. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rosetta S. Elkin digitally to Texas Tech College of Architecture. Thanks. And before we begin, I just want to mention, if you have questions during the lecture, feel free to type them into the Q&A on Zoom, and we will get to them afterwards. Wonderful. Rosetta, take it away.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for that super generous introduction. You really, yeah, you went through a lot of yeah, I suppose the different avenues that I've tried to take through the field, and I so appreciate your kind words in doing so. I'm going to share my screen. I can't see anyone now except the red square, so I'm just going to go ahead, and if anyone wants to tell me that anything is going wrong, you'll have to text it, I suppose. So if I share screen now, and thank you for your patience as I do this. So essentially, yeah, in our time together, I just would like to tell you a little more about what I do, both in scholarship and in practice. I'm simply going to speak over my slides and tell you my story. And the story is really why we might look again at what is commonly known as green infrastructure. because this green is so much more than photosynthesis. So let's change our language a little and open our minds together to the reality that our one species, Homo sapien, is sharing a world with a myriad of other species, and that plants are not at the bottom of Aristotle's so-called ladder. In fact, we are an entirely plant-dependent species. And so I encourage each of you to take another look at how you treat, specify, and relate to the planted planet. The work I will tell you about today progressed prior to the pandemic through a significant amount of rather strenuous fieldwork. I'm telling you this because my work on planted infrastructure began in a post-Sandy world, which means that there was hope for change following the adversity that followed the storm. I'll get back to that. For now, I'd like to plant another seed. Our work as designers, my work as a landscape architect, must change if we are to work responsibly. I used to give talks about either my scholarship or my client-driven work, my studio, but now I don't do that anymore. They actively inform one another. I now see them as mingled efforts to contribute to both student development, the next generation, through discourse and ideation that springs from a very personal nature that climate change is, the very personal nature of climate change that seeps into our social worlds. So the change is no longer simply a topic of study. As Margaret Atwood remarks, it is everything change. We don't need more studies, more science, it's proven. Exceeding 2 degrees of warming will have catastrophic consequences that we need to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. Seems like a little, does a lot. The world is currently on track to surpass both of those limits, however, and landscape contributes. The design field, sure, but I'll talk about landscape. A third of California's water budget goes to irrigation, mostly residential irrigation. The market value of garden pesticides is $8 billion in the United States. Pesticides. And while we cannot shake the reliance on containerized plants, a $14 billion industry that creates an overabundance of unreclaimed plastic waste, as a field, we are approaching ecological scales with horticultural techniques. So I'm here to critique that, but I'm also here to offer some alternatives. I aim to contribute in my work with applied attention by tinkering with the systems, processes, and details of our profession, even with plastic pots, mow and blow, drip irrigation. Not the sexiest part of our profession, but the most consumptive. Those methods and means are definitely not keeping up with the times. It is my belief that you, students, can creatively engage with the mainstream public discourse on climate change by making how we work as important as what it looks like, especially since renderings do little to advance the discourse. We have to get out of this Photoshop rut and get back to the land itself. The soils, plants, and creatures, the crusts of geology, and the acts of cultivation that sustain our species. What wants to be restored in the 21st century is our relationship to land, to the living processes that sustain. We do not need to restore the land itself so much as our lost connections to it. What this means along the most floodable shores, concretized floodplains, and renourished beachfronts is, I believe, to unbuild in order to value the land that is left behind and resist the desire for mastery over our environment and the craving for ownership over vulnerable land, which is truly a 20th century legacy. So I will address this other look today by talking about retreat. The deepest motive for talking about retreat, a contentious term, is to embrace it as an important attribute of adaptation. Retreat is a catalyst because it unsettles and thus begins a process of recovering our broken relations, amending connections. To advocate for retreat is to defend the discomfort it inevitably raises and use it to heal our relationship with other species and the lands, waters, and soils. We cannot escape from our past, but we can value change as a means to amend our future relations. When retreat is embraced, we allow space for other kinds of being. And one that is particularly interesting to me is to grow a space where plant life can spread, thrive, and often hold together soggy, desiccated, and heavily urbanized soils. I speak to you as a designer and as a landscape architect, but I also speak to you as a resident of Vermont and Brooklyn, as a mother, as a French Canadian, and frankly, as a professor. My work aims to elevate the role of plants in all of those venues, in our profession, but also in our lives, in our stories and in our histories, in what we leave behind. I study the active, amendatory practices between humans and landscapes that emphasize acceptance, reciprocity, and care. In this sense, not building back seems like an opportunity to establish land-based relations. As I mentioned, when I began this research project, I was writing in a post-Sandy world, trapped in superstorm rhetoric, replete with resilience funding and rebuild protocols. What began to occur to me was the world of disaster management creatively invented the idea of a superstorm, but failed to devise any new or creative response to it. Everyone was just doing the same thing. Seawalls got higher, berms were designed to be wider, and sand was put back into place, blown into fake dune formations. Rather than consider the force of change to imagine an alternative configuration, I was forced into the ritual procedures of planners, designers, and architects who tended to treat the changing world in much the same way as it always had. That is, without climate and without change. As federal coffers opened, designers were invited into project making by agencies scrambling to help solve tangible worldly problems. At the time, rebuilding or building back better was the main concern that drew policy into the muddled, mysterious living world. I was leading an academic research team, and we wanted to talk about not building back and proposing instead to turn many of the privately held parcels into verdant public lands. The idea of intentional retreat, ceding land that had been used for human settlements back to various natural processes, came as an affront to the architects, planners, and engineers who were part of our project. Our funding partners were also not happy. It was clear that the aphorism, build back better, was invented to preserve existing bylaws, restore visible infrastructure, continue to ignore invisible relationships that were not washed away by the storm. Architecturally, the opportunity lay in the number of towns, houses, subdivisions, malls, and parking lots that lay strewn across the coast in ruins. Ecologically, we know that it was impossible to put it all back into place. Yet this is the lineage of resilience planning, a tactic that made it possible for landscape architects to engage with vulnerable shorelines by appearing to clean up the mess and make it look natural again. Of course, this includes millions of plastic pots, groundwater pumped through plastic drip line, concretized details, barriers, and berms. Fake it to make it. To engage with these projects would mean playing according to the rules of a game rigged by capital against both the residents who were suffering and against the climate. And I didn't want to play. I quit the project. I refused the funding and began a project called Landscapes of Retreat with a few students in my office, a counter proposal to build back better. To grow the project, first we had to figure out what retreat is and what retreat is not. Retreat is not nostalgia for a prior condition, and it is not a return to a previous ecological state. Retreat is also not leaving in defeat, nor is it giving up hope. Instead, acknowledging retreat creates hope by giving up something, but not what you might expect. It is giving up our false assumptions of human mastery over the environment. Giving up on mastery is not abandoning our relationships to land or place, but reinforcing relations by redefining them anew. The fact that so many relationships between humans and the natural world have become largely exploitative and extractionist might be hard to accept, as is the recognition of any relationship that becomes toxic for one or more of its members. But the fear of recognizing this condition does not address the urgency. As James Baldwin once wrote, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. The assumption of human mastery over nature must be faced courageously to make way for other practices to emerge. The failure of human mastery over nature is everywhere in evidence. It was tallied in July 2019 when meteorologists recorded the Earth's hottest month, and again this summer when we shattered those same records. As we speak, Puerto Rico is not only reeling from 5 years of regulatory neglect, but under the terms of unrelenting rain and widespread flash flooding moving across a warmer ocean that is not of their making. This kind of planetary change is not simply dissipated as the temperatures cool back down, nor is it distributed evenly around the globe. Instead, these records land somewhere and climate change takes place. Warmer degrees mean damper monsoons, torrential storms, liquescent ice cover, waterless soil, oceanic hurricanes, bomb cyclones, not to mention superstorms. But statistics are not helping us amend our relations or change our details. Why not let statistics go and look around? If you consider the land under your home or under your feet, it might seem obvious to move, at once creating a public shoreline and a safe setback for development. From despair to hope. Why not plant living soil rather than concretize it? And why not cultivate a tradition of care for future generations? I've just finished writing Landscapes of Retreat, and it is arranged through 5 global cases. They speak to the vitality of defining retreat as an amendatory practice between settlement and climate, between people and place and plants. The 5 cases are spread around the world and include Nijinomatsubara Forest in Japan, El Maule River in Chile, Niugtaq Village in Alaska, Langtang Park in Nepal, and the Gaspésie Peninsula in Quebec, Canada. There are myriad stories embedded in each case, and these stories inevitably include me, their narrator, as well as my collaborators and countless seen and unseen protagonists of all species, scales, and temporalities. The narrative emerged from my personal belief in acceptance, not as a neutral activity, but as a specific mode of design attention. I hope that through these encounters, Landscapes of Retreat can relay new meaning to what can all too often appear to be suffering without purpose, to those who aspire to live and thrive within an enlivened and animated world, and through commitment to our shared future. In each case, to acknowledge the risk is to recognize our relations. Perhaps adaptation is, at best, a way of paying attention to risk as an ally, that is, a compassionate acceptance of the living environment. This would suggest that our efforts to track, chart, and recover from the effects of a warmer climate are no longer as relevant as the collective effort to acknowledge that the consequences might change how we live, where we settle, what and when we build. The other topic my team and I had to uncover was how retreat was different from relocation. Simply put, retreat values the land that is left behind. Thus, retreat is not policy. It is an active process that can only be enacted by those who have a relationship to land. The difference between relocation and retreat matters. It matters to establishing more inclusive futures. It matters because any discussion of relocation treats lively communities as a product, an object, an asset. For instance, buildings can be relocated brick by brick. Asking a living community to relocate is challenging because it breaks apart relations. If a church is relocated, the impact is felt by the congregation. The same is true for a school and its students, homes and the generations embedded, memory in place. On the other hand, glaciers retreat, as we all know, they cannot be relocated. Fish retreat to lower lake levels, seeking shelter. In military terms, an army retreats not in defeat, but in order to secure a more strategic location. When humans and other creatures decide to retreat, they are usually informed by cues observed in their environment. Retreat emerges as a unique form of adaptation that does not adhere to the same conditions as relocation, which tend to be driven by fear and external agendas. The difference matters because, like a process or an ecology, the emergent characteristics of a living organism is non-transferable. The failure to distinguish between relocation and retreat leads to unequal policy that often forces a population to rebuild in otherwise vulnerable landscapes. So if retreat is a decision reached by the community and relocation is a procedural outcome of institutionalized programs, then how did we differentiate in the research? Earlier, there was a slide. I know they're passing by rather in whatever order they appear, but there are 4 conditions of retreat that we found to study our cases and to begin to establish these sort of land-based relations through retreat. The 4 conditions are a heightened perception of local environmental degradation or ongoing risk and its negative impact on human welfare. In other words, people that live there understand the risk they live with. 2, an established relationship to the past. It could be within oral traditions, elders, other species, archaeological scholarship, or experience in a number of timescales, but some connection to the past. A degree of political organization within the community to facilitate effective management, and thus a reliance on relatively stable social organizations rather than outside intervention or assistance. And a communal naming, ritual, or ceremony that begins life anew. Meanwhile, the definition of landscape remains unwritten. While this might create a problem for academics and institutions who attempt to brand and conquer the design discourse, I'm growing more comfortable with the idea that meaning is much more complicated than any definition. Landscapes hold meaning, and in this sense, landscape shares a common ambiguity with other slippery terms like nature and art. Landscape is experienced. It is more a feeling of place than it is an object or set of objects. That feeling is relational, a host of relations in relation. Landscape is nature influenced and rearranged by humans, from the soils under our feet that are now awash in toxic pesticides, to the warmer ocean currents crowded with microplastics, all the way up into the night sky, sparkling with new Earth-observing satellites. In a time of planetary and political extremes, landscape is the opportunity to inhabit otherwise. In landscapes of retreat, the term landscape refers to the earth animated by activity. The term retreat suggests that settlement patterns are not fixed, but might also be enlivened by removing permanent settlement. I turn to firsthand experiences embedded in fieldwork in order to lift up temporally rich land-based practices rather than phased standards of our profession. In many cases, there are also significant emotional challenges related to grieving of place. These processes of grieving remind us that retreat isn't easy, and that creating new amendatory and reparative relations to place also means challenging long-held beliefs about our place in the world, about restoration, about what we have a right to expect, and how we take into account our responsibility to the next generation, as well as our non-human kin and more than human neighbors. From a method point of view, my aim is to bridge the increasing discrepancy between remote sensing and local knowledge by working on the ground and engaging in committed and sometimes necessarily patient fieldwork. As images of the changing planet become emblematic of our time, designers often respond with a scrutiny towards amplified scales that do little to describe the messy reality of everyday life. This has given rise to a growing interest. I certainly hear this from my students, in the very materials or elements of the transformation, not the analog of it. In particular, this category of evidence really can only be collected through firsthand engagement. All research, from the molecular to the continental, requires a scale of study, and these scales are often refined in the field and rarely at the desktop. Landscapes of Retreat attempts to relay some of the work on the ground to the creative disciplines, thereby expanding and enhancing our repertoire of strategies for climate adaptation in collaboration with the changing landscape. So with all of this in mind or underfoot, let's turn to this term resilience for a few minutes. I think I should have more than a few minutes, but I said a few minutes. I would like you all to consider that stability is not a feature of resilience, but I'll explain. Explicit in the belief in building back better is strength and certainty. such that resiliency projects are now, over a decade later, after the popularization of the term, creating a false sense of security for many communities that cannot effectively reduce their own risks without the life support of the systems created by the regulatory environment. What I mean by this is that most Americans cannot approach the four terms of retreat, missing as they are a connection to the land that includes a heightened perception of risk, an established relationship to the past, effective community organization, or access to a common history. So back to resilience. The word did not enter contemporary usage until well after its first acceptance in ecology in 1973. It was cleverly appropriated from material science for its application in material science to elasticity gradients, the sort of push and pull exchange that happens at a molecular level that may or may not change the material itself. It was imported from material science into ecology by the prominent ecologist C.S. Halling, Buzz Halling, a Canadian ecologist. Just had to throw that in there. Resilience was a word he used to help him explain complex system dynamics through predation. He studied predators scales, and mostly pathogens. In 1973, Dr. Halling wrote a paper entitled Resilience and Stability of Ecological Systems. This marks the first use of the term in ecology in the physical, natural, living world. In the paper, he defines resilience as, quote, a measure of the persistence of systems and their ability to absorb change and disturbance and still maintain the same relationships between populations. So it wasn't about the formal characteristics, it was about maintaining relationships. Absorb change, maintain relationships. In appropriating the term resilience, Halling applied it suggestively to time rather than space, using evidence collected through observation of behavior, amplitude, and frequency of oscillations. In the opening of the article, he writes a memorable opening line: individuals die, populations disappear, and species become extinct. Very optimistic way to start a paper. But the paper is great, and I suggest you download it. It explains that the amount of impact from a disturbance on the micro relationships of organisms can either result in the absorbance of a shock or in an alternative configuration. It never goes back. There's no going back. That is a totally contemporary definition. An alternative configuration is future oriented, and it might not look the same as the stable state. He spent 30 years after writing that paper trying to continue to unpack this term resilience. In this first publication, Halling explains, and I am going to go into it in a little more depth because I hope that being careful with our terms, especially as students and educators, we can grow this fantastic word and not let it go the wayside. Overuse, right? So Halling explains how temporal transformation is common to all biota and a crucial part of ecological frameworks from development through formation. This is also what he terms the adaptive cycle. You might have heard of that. That's also Halling's term. For Halling, the term resilience was implicitly related to duration, which he described using intervals. So intervals of time create enough strength in the system to animate recovery. I treasure his description of what he calls multi-stable states, which suggests that the measure of performance in a living system is manifold because all of these different timescales overlap and intersect, and that's what allows them to persist. Those durational systems that are working and operating at different timescales in relation to one another, not isolated. That also means that when time is interrupted within that, essentially some predators may spike in population or disrupt that state far from equilibrium. So there are these conditions that exist in the margins at the edge of equilibrium. And in those edges or margins, that seem marginal because they're at the edge of a system actually have the power to flip the whole system, the whole ecology. Like a woolly adelgid flipped the hemlock forest. For those of you that don't know, this tiny little white powdery pathogen has come into the Northeast and within 10 years decimated hemlock forests. It flipped the system. Another example would be something operating at the margins like COVID-19, that when given an opportunity to enter into timescales in a stable state, flips the human equilibrium for a time. Prior to Holling's suggestion, ecology was obsessed with single equilibrium assumptions. The notion was long held that an ecological community basically grows and reaches a climax state. The assumption, let's say, that a young forest grows up and overcomes any kind of adversity and in order to become a stable state, an old growth forest, and then it shall stay an old growth forest forevermore. That's, of course, a single state. A single state now, since 1973, has been replaced with the multi-stable state theory that Holling brought in through the term resilience. That life is a journey towards stability was proven false. Now let's think about that in terms of some of our shorelines. Are we on a journey towards stability? And if so, then there are lifespans and timescales at the margins that can very quickly flip the system. Holling proved that ecology was targeting momentary equilibrium states which overlook the dynamism of the multi-stable state. The most predictable outcome of living systems, it turns out, is instability, an important attribute that changed the discourse so many years ago. Holling called that instability resilience because it did a better job of designating the need for novel forms of change, predicated on high variability and meaningful behavior expressed far from equilibrium. Time became a generative feature of ecological theory, as Holling ascertained that the most resilient systems in the world are simultaneously those that display the lowest stability. So high stability, low resilience. Low stability enables and invites resilient behavior. I'm inspired by Holling. Hopefully that's clear, because he proves that the command and control approach can, through its own success, create the conditions for collapse. Fast forward, and the foundations of resilience are all but lost on the engineering, planning, and design fields, on the federal mandates and proclamations that embrace single state equilibrium. A seawall is a single state equilibrium. So are foundations and berms, if they are on vulnerable territory. So what does low stability look like? Can we design in anticipation of it? Can uncertainty be proffered as a predictable outcome? I will end today with these thoughts because I hope that the multi-stable state is an invitation to bring more species into our consortium as designers, more species that can bring different timescales and durations into our work. In lands where soils are imported, drained, filled, and altered for human gain, why not imagine another form of rebuild? A different land use or a reworked landscape in order to further our collective cultural and social values? Can disturbance become a catalyst for designing? Can construction become a process of regeneration? I'd like to acknowledge that we are suspended between two worlds, between the systematic regularity of the accelerating crisis and the irregularity of finding time to acknowledge it. Perhaps landscapes of retreat might indicate that variability itself is more important than constancy, that we can change our ways. In his final public lecture, Dr. Holling concluded his talk by reflecting on the number of collapses he had analyzed across his very long career. And his remarks are so well placed that I borrow them today to end my lecture. Also, while I show you in the background or in the foreground, one of the nicest, most surprising outcomes of Landscapes of Retreat was actually working with one of the communities we visited and spent time in, because we asked them the very simple question when they did decide to retreat as a community. And we went to talk to them about it. We said, what are you doing with the land that's left behind? And that instigated ideas, exchange, collaboration, connection. And in this case, the design of the future intertidal where houses once stood. But back to Holling's quote, with gratitude for his voice and encouragement to each of you to pick up some of Holling's work, dry as it might be sometimes, I will end with a less dry quote. Quote, it is time to recognize that we are moving into regimes of unknowns, of literally the unknown, not just unexpected, not just uncertain, but fundamentally unknown. When you are faced with a situation where there are deep unknowns, the only thing you can do is experiment. The only thing you can do is propose ideas and begin to test them in action. And I can think of no more welcoming and beautiful quote to extend to a future generation of designers than to please go experiment and propose ideas and invite change into your practices. Thank you. I'm not sure what to do now, so I'll stay here until I'm told.
Hi, Rosetta. My name is Tara. We met earlier today, and I'm going to be talking to you through that camera. And I'm going to open the Q&A. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your work with us today. While the audience gets warmed up, I might ask you to help me understand a little bit better some of your terms, such as retreat, and if you might be able to give some concrete examples of situations where that occurs, and how does retreat relate to the words such as like abandonment? You know, does abandonment happen first and then we rehabilitate, or are you talking about like a planned return, like a planned returning of the resources?
Sure. I'll start with the term retreat by giving you those concrete examples you asked for. I spend time on 5 of them in the book, but there's also a dossier online with just lists that my students and I put together, trying to figure out what differentiates retreat from relocation, how this case could be called retreat and how this one is relocation. And we tried to not look at relocation cases. For the most part, relocation fails. It fails, and I don't mean that in such a negative terms, but usually it's designed by powers beyond the community, and it is brought in, and it is a kind of force majeure where we have a plan and you have to be part of it. Your house is in the purple zone and therefore you have to do this and that, follow these procedures. As I tried to explain, when you treat living organisms, including humans and other creatures, like objects, you create an antagonistic environment that doesn't always bode well for the outcomes of well-intentioned projects. Many relocation projects are well-intentioned, but if you try to pick up people and move them, or try to pick up a tree and move it, or try to pick up the beach and move it, it usually has a lot of repercussions because you're treating the animate world as inanimate objects. Many species retreat. They do so on different timescales, seasonally, over very long periods, nomadically. You could look at humankind and think that actually settlement on floodplains is only a couple hundred years old, really, if you talk about concrete bases and land tenure. So what is happening now, that, or at least what I feel, is that there's a shakiness going on between relocation and retreat, because these lands have, on shorelines especially, become so very vulnerable that there is no build back better option. The issue then is, how do you enable your communities, as, let's say, as a mayor, in the case of Saint Flavie, to give you a concrete example, the mayor went to his community and said, what do we need to do? He didn't tell them, he went to them. They started to host a number of meetings, so many. The federal government in that case was telling them, you have to move. And he said, we have to come up with some other ideas. It can't just be, you have to move. And they did. They came up with pretty incredible ideas for the same kind of funding stream, and they enacted them. And this is one of the reasons it's a community-led initiative. They are deciding where to retreat to, whether or not they move their home or rebuild anew, and how to allocate the funds on a case-by-case basis for every individual. It's no blanket term. People also, if they decide not to buy in, are staying there. They're auctioning houses. There's many different avenues. There's not just one, which is, you have to move. Take the buyout money and move. That's one example. Other examples, that one is much, let's say, more of a trickle in terms of change. But all of the examples in the book, all of the cases, I met people in communities that had very close relationships to each other and to the land. And without those close relationships, relocation comes in and it forces a wedge between people. And usually it ends in difficult conversations instead of a mandatory ones. I don't want to take up too much time giving you more examples, but the decision to not build back on land that has been disturbed is also respect for that land itself. In the case of Japan, you saw this bay photograph at one point with this massive forest, right? So the decision not to move back, but to plant a forest and commemorate and memorialize that space, and also create a public land, is much more meaningful in terms of valuing change than in trying to push back against that movable shoreline.
It seems to me that you're really asking us to have a paradigm change. You know, you're asking all of society really to evoke a paradigm change, both of where instability isn't a bad word, right? But also to look at things at very long timescales, and to look at projects as an entire cycle, right? Like what goes beyond the ribbon cutting, right? And as someone, you know, as any person who has a landscaped lawn, you know how much work it takes to keep it looking that way, right? Everything is constantly in motion. So in the you're a professor, and in the studio with your students, what kind of things do you do to help evoke this sensibility change with them? How do we incorporate this? How do we broaden our vision, even just within the architectural studio practice?
This is a beautiful question. Well, I think first and foremost, you have to want to. And I see in my students, and maybe it's because they're entering a landscape architectural profession, and they have to take soils class and planting class and plant identification and other core courses that architects don't take. They have with them a sensitivity and a care for the living environment. They just don't know what to do with it yet. Usually it's just sort of, it's nascent, right? And when you study plants, it's very humbling. Timescales are one of the first things to come up. You can't hurry up a plant and you can't tell it to grow up, or you really have to listen to its language and its behavior, and it behaves. There are over 300,000 species of plant. We're one species, just to remind you, we're Homo sapien. There are 300,000 plus, and many not yet discovered or named, of species as different as a salamander and your dog. And yet most people walk outside their front door and they can, give directions by telling you where the closest Starbucks is, and probably tell you the make and model of every car on the street, but could not tell you what the plants are on that same street, or give you directions by telling you to turn left at a robinia. It's a language and a literacy that is so lost in our current society that to regain it it can't be forced. You have to want to. You have to wake up one day and say, why do I know the make of every model of car on the street and none of the trees? And then make a decision to learn about them a little more. And when you do, in any way, it doesn't have to be scientific. You don't need an app. You could also just start to call the trees by how they look, or the plants by, their color or texture. But you're forming a relationship because you're noticing things in your environment that are also alive. And it can be very humbling over time. And so my students, when they're drawing a plan, they've just come in from the field, or in from a botanic garden, or in from a reconstructed shoreline, and they understand to some degree, or at least they're beginning to understand, that when they draw a plant, they're faking it. They're drawing an outline of a plant in one particular moment. And so it forces them to look more carefully at how they're representing that time scale. I don't know if it's an entire paradigm shift. I have to say, some of the it's very generous, or I really think that the research for this book, especially now in retrospect, was just putting some attention on these incredible projects that are already happening all over the world. They're not invented, and I wasn't a part of them. I'm just saying, hey, look at this and look at what has happened. And some of them are deeply historical, like the one in Japan. And so we can look to cases of retreat for signals, instead of what tends to happen, which is only looking at the failures.
You were talking about the difficulty of representing moving things in a static drawing, or you're talking about how we tend to look at things as objects, and then they're represented as an object on a paper. I do wonder if we also need to adapt our aesthetics, right? I'm just thinking about like how slow the xeriscaping lawn, right? Keep bringing it back to my life. It has caught on, and even in our city of Lubbock, there are a few pioneers out there, but the neighbors are wary. In the drawing, I think that, aesthetically, that could be one place where we begin to operate in terms of adjusting our visions. And I have to say, as your slideshow went through, and I was looking at all the beautiful images of landscape, there were a couple times these really intriguing representations popped up, which showed the tree roots as it showed them first of all. And then it showed the magnitude of them, right? I've just made me think that would be so incredible if to acknowledge just sort of the magnitude of the plant life around us. If those trees were not just copy paste silhouettes, but at the very least contain the root ball, right? Have you found other ways? Because drawing is one of our languages when we study design. Other ways to represent that different awareness?
I'm always looking for examples. The most, but on a very basic level, it's horrifying to see Army Corps details that are blank in section. They're always in section because that way it can be extruded forevermore. And these sections where the sectional attribute of whatever it is it's cutting through, let's say it's a seawall, is where you put all the text, because you pull it down and you put all the text there and all the measurements and your dim lines and everything. But that's actually the life of the project. That's where the life of the project is. Your project will succeed or fail based on the specifications in that space. What it looks like above ground is secondary. I really don't know how else to put it. It's not just the roots, although roots are hugely misunderstood, both in my profession and in design more broadly. And soils are living, a living medium. So it's not just that you said we treat things like objects. Yes. And when things are objects, like I treat my phone like a thing. I'm not precious with it at all, to the chagrin of my son sometimes, because it's just a thing. I'd rather be precious about other living organisms and other living creatures on the planet than the things. So when you can outline a thing. But even this thing is made up of resources from all over the planet, right? That are just coming together for a minute in my phone as this thing called a phone. And then they're going to go back into the world. And so, when you study ecology, which is also something I imagine that your students can, in third year, go take some electives, in other parts of your amazing school, and taking an ecology course. Ecology is systems thinking. Ecology is understanding our place within a system. And the building can then also be thought about as, as a system within a system within a global system, since it is made up of resources. I happen to study, non-sentient living organisms, plants. So they don't have a brain, but they behave and they act and they decide and they grow and they breathe. They do all kinds of things without a brain. And it's, again, to use the same word as before, it's pretty humbling. And once you're aware of it, it makes it very hard to copy paste and outline, which I hope students will begin to experiment with it. I mean, those renderings that we have gotten so used to making were novel a decade, 2 decades ago. They were remarkable. And we got so far with them in bringing the public along with some of the thinking and ideation that designers are so good at. But they've become a default mechanism, almost without further interrogation of what they're representing. And so in my field anyways, unlike your field, because the building, the architecture looks so great, magnificent at times when it is new and newly built. And it very often looks very much like the rendering. The landscape doesn't. Plants are small and they need a lot of help along the way, and they've been moved around and stuck in different soils. And, you're assuming the same timescales of an object versus an ecology in those renderings. And so my field, maybe much more so design, I would say design broadly, but my field really needs to move away from the rendering, because it's always rendering the perfect lollipop tree at age 50. And that is a kind of lie to the public that yeah, that we've got to own up to. Experimenting is, I really hope your students are experimenting. I encourage my students to experiment. That's why I really like that last quote by Holling. You know, if you already know Photoshop and you know how to do a beautiful rendering before you start school, then you don't really need to do them in school, right? You're not learning anything. You're not getting, you know, what do you need to go to school for if you're just going to represent what you already know what to do with, and how to get the perfect drop shadow and the wonderful kind of sparkly day that you're skilled at doing with your filters. I mean, if you already know how to do that, that's fantastic. But then try something else. Just, you're in school. It's a safe place to test, and we need it. We need your generation to be the design activists and design citizens that start to push towards and meet the challenges of the times.
Do we have any questions from the audience? I don't want to neglect you.
There is one on the chat.
Well, then it said it was answered. I don't know if the author clicks it as answered. Will you run and get the mic, Brian? Oh, great. Ozma, do you want to ask a question? Oh, okay.
Well, thank you, Rosetta,
Do you
for the
wanna come up
thoughtful
here, Uwe?
presentation. I really appreciate it, especially the imagery. And I noticed that a lot of the photographs you showed were on the threshold of a body of water. Often it appeared to be the coast, and you talked about retreat and erosion. And my question is here for the kind of the students here in Lubbock, in a semi-arid area you might saw, we have a different type of erosion, the erosion of the topsoil, for example, through less participation over the last few years. So my question to you is, how do you might, or what you might suggest for our students operating in a semi-arid to arid climate, how they approach it? As we have seen, you had lots of areas with shorelines, but how you might suggest how the students approach that? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's I suppose it's my bias, or maybe it's where I live in the world. But resilience is a term that has come to define a lot of wet-dry interface planning, let's say. And you know, you can enlighten me if it is coming up with things like topsoil erosion in Texas. And if so, then I guess I would also just love to know from you how it's being used. This is one of the reasons I tried to get into the actual definition of resilience, because in the Northeast post Sandy, and then we saw it with Katrina, and just it was just resilience planning without sort of knowing, well, what does that mean? It continues, which is what I was trying to describe, is that it continues to basically just let governments funded by FEMA in post-disaster scenarios do the exact same thing as they've always done. I know not everybody will agree with me. That's just what I am bringing today. But to your question, we know that climate change is everything change, right? So it's drier dries and hotter hots and wetter wets and windier winds, and everything is more extreme, where all of our norms have, you know, we've basically had a very stable couple hundred years, in the Holocene, and now things are starting to become more unstable. And so this idea of embracing uncertainty, I think, has potential because we are living in uncertain times. The greatest thing I can imagine sharing with your students, and I wish we could walk outside the lecture hall and put on some boots and go see some of these sites right now. But the loss of the soil, the loss of our topsoil, is our inheritance. We can't do much about it now. We have lost our topsoil in this country. And the great news, though, is that we can make soil. We know how to make soil. It just takes time, and it can't be hurried up, and it can't be chemically inoculated. I mean, it can be, but to what end, right? But we need to start saving soil and making soil and allowing those processes to regenerate before we come in and mechanize the surface again. And so I think that there's a great project, a design project in soil making, just as there was a great project of park making in Olmsted's time. And it's about changing your mind about what design is allowed to do and what design is allowed to make. And it isn't a sort of, but that's for the scientists at all, because making soil, unlike sitting back and allowing soil to form, is a human endeavor. And so it's the same as cooking. It's the same as mixing concrete. You know, we have to make soil. And so if your students are interested in healthier lands with access to equitable foodstuffs and meaningful relationships with the soils that sustain us, then maybe you want to run a studio called Designing Soil and fill in those sections that Tara was mentioning with specifics.
Thank you.
That's an idea. So actually, could I just ask you just quickly, so are people using the term resilience to define like erosion at the agricultural scale?
Well, it's more like describing our area where we are. So, for example, we have students from Houston and the shore area, as you know, Texas meets the Gulf of Mexico, but we also are largely the only school in Texas in a semi-arid landscape, who is also, because of that, defined a bit because of the land. Mm-hmm. And, when you actually talk to us about of a retreat, like we look at civilization like Mesa Verde, which is in Colorado, and mm-hmm. pre-Columbian group who actually moved because of a drought. So they did what you suggested not to do. So there were in history precedents in this part of the world, which we are at the beginning of the Southwest, where cultures moved because they had to, and they decided to move as a group. So these are precedents we study, and I just try to add some context because our area is more semi-arid to arid than, say, if you have visited Central Texas or the Hill Country.
Yeah, I'm so pleased with your mention of some of those precedents. This is to Tara's point about a paradigm shift. Not at all. It's just a reminder of our human history, right? I mean, we can decide to move if conditions worsen. It just hasn't been the tradition in the last couple hundred years. And I'm sure your students also study and that they're aware of the 100th meridian to some degree, right? And that this line in the soil, right, really did a lot to identify the boundary between humidity and aridity. And there are just a lot of creatures, plants, animals, insects, humans that thrive in more humid and in more arid environments. And yet we kind of treat, especially because Texas is bifurcated by this line, sort of treat both sides of the line the same, when actually culturally, socially, naturally, there are very different ways of living between aridity and humidity. In architecture, in design, in what grows, in how we eat, in so many ways. And so this is also what I mean by a connection, establishing a connection to land, to seeing and knowing how change manifests in our environments, rather than abstractions of it. And it sounds wonderful that your students are learning precedents. Sorry, my dog is like freaking out in the background. I don't know if anyone can hear that. No? Okay, good. Yeah. Thank you for answering.
We have another question from the audience.
Rosetta, thank you so much for your presentation. I especially enjoyed from your visual representation and all the photos and images and photographies that you shared. And also the part that you also start to compare the different transcontinental case studies, for example, like the one in Japan. So my question is about the political implication of what you called as planting infrastructure. I actually liked, this keyword that you use, and I would like to ask you more on this. And the aim here is like, if you remember in the previous COP 26 summit in Glasgow back to 2021, we heard a lot from the experience of different countries, in different contexts, and how they try to advance these environmental policies. So my question is like, how you, through comparing the different case studies that you worked on, what are the political implications of this planting infrastructure, and how we can advance the environmental policies and this adaptation and mitigation strategies built upon that? Thank you so much, Rosetta.
Thank you. It's a very articulate question, but it's full of it's very loaded. I will definitely hark back to the last question, because planting, as mentioned in the introduction, I start my most recent book by saying humans are a planting species. We are really good at planting, and one of the reasons we're really good at planting is because we're also really good at taking trees down. And so there's this kind of cycle of gain and loss that we're quite comfortable with. So when I say planting infrastructure, I'm trying to play on our desire for doing something, right? Like it's like wanting to engage with issues, and planting is very often something that is turned to as a means to an end. But it also has political repercussions, to your point. Just turning to tree planting, let's say, on the west side of the 100th meridian, would be to tap into water resources that are shared. And plants are really greedy, thirsty creatures, and they will drink them up or die. And so we have to think carefully about what planting means when we're planting in areas that don't host as much plant as other areas. In the more humid areas, especially on coastlines, which is where the term where I try to advocate for planting infrastructure, is a way to value the land that is left behind, because we are entering, I can speak forever about retreat as a historic process and as a necessary future one, but we are firmly rooted in a present that doesn't want to accept the change that is all around us in the past and coming in the future. If we can get ahead of some of these vulnerable lands that are eroding quickly, meters a year in some places, not inches anymore, then we are being preemptive as designers, as humans. Unfortunately, that's political, to use your terms, because there is actually no mechanism for preemptive planning in America. You can only work in a post-disaster America. You can't find funds for retreat. They're not there. There are no funds for relocation. And so this happens because of the way that our government is set up and the way that FEMA operates as the crux of all funding in disaster scenarios. Probably your students have studied this, but generally speaking, FEMA is a problem to any preemptive practices. We could debate that, sorry. But FEMA isn't, FEMA's like a bank, right? FEMA's not doing anything. The Army Corps is physically doing things. FEMA is a bank that opens after the president, with the support of Congress, has declared a disaster. Otherwise, FEMA is closed for business. And so when it's a disaster, FEMA opens. All of a sudden, there's FEMA money. That's because the bank opened, because of the declaration. And slowly, the bank closes until it's not a disaster anymore. And so people are running to pull funds from that bank in a disaster scenario. And in a disaster scenario, you can't talk about retreat. You can't talk, you have to be working with the issues at hand and the difficulty in faced. But the bank closes and people are still there and communities are still ruined and land is still eroding. And that is what's political. What's political is that we need to address the chronic nature of climate change and not the episodic nature of climate change. What do I mean by that? A storm is an episode. It comes and goes. In ecology, it's also called an episodic disturbance. It comes in and it goes. I'm sorry about the dogs.
You're very passionate right now. I think that's what he's responding to.
Really? Okay, a hurricane is an episode. I hope it's fun because I can't see the audience, so I hope that everybody's with me.
Yes.
But just in case I'm going to say it again in case, maybe you just heard it and you just left class and you just heard it and you're like, oh my God, I'm hearing it again. I'm still going to say it again. An episode comes and goes. It creates a great deal of disturbance, but in the face of episodic disturbance, ecology recovers. In fact, many ecological processes need disturbance. They need that episode to come in and wash the slate clean, so to speak, or cause fire or drought, even when it wasn't so widespread, would come in and it comes in and it goes, it passes. Chronic disturbance. Ecologies cannot recover from chronic disturbances because there are very few chronic disturbances, except climate change is one, humankind is one. A chronic disturbance is with you. It's a little bit every day. It's the drip on a bathtub. You think, oh, it's just dripping. That'll never be a flood. It's just dripping. It's that slow accumulation that is easy to ignore. That's what climate change is. And so we need design models that address the chronic, not the episodic. And the episodic is where design is sitting right now with the resilience planning, because it is funded by the FEMA coffers only. And until designers can advocate for preemptive practices, we're going to be stuck with that quick action that is often doing it's cleaning up the mess and making life, restoring life, but it doesn't get to the root of the problem. These are sort of basic tenets of ecology that you learn in, a kind of ecology 101, if you will, that it's, you definitely heard that. which is worth thinking about, because if you study landscape architecture, you're going to take Ecology 1, you're going to learn about the difference between chronic and episodic risk. So it changes the nature of what you design. And I love your question because it's also political. Until we have funding for preemptive practices, it's going to stay political. Does that make sense to everyone?
Mm-hmm.
Are there nods going on? Because I'm glad to, yeah, I am passionate. I do not mind talking about it as much as much as you want to listen, I suppose. But it's conflated very often, these differences between episodic and chronic, all the time conflated. And like any good design, you want to be reactive to the issue at hand. Yeah, there's our planet is chronically sick, not episodically sick.
I have a couple of questions in the Q&A. Do we have any others in the audience right now? So one is actually from a student. And so it's kind of diverting us back to the arena of study, and then what we can do as designers, really, in terms of how we represent our design. She's asking, how do you suggest we map projective realities while still respecting the heritage of a site? And how can these projective mappings unveil new knowledge of our shared or private space?
What a beautiful question. I hope you spend your whole studies trying to answer that. I wish I had a simple answer for you. I'm sure with such a respectful question that you can come up with some respectful responses, right? But it sounds like embedded in the question is this conversation of rendering, right? If you go to someone who lives on vulnerable land and you present a rendering of a house in another land, or what you can do with the land that's left behind or something else, and it looks shiny and corporate, and somehow it's doing disservice. So what could you show instead, right? If I could paraphrase. And at the end of the day, our renderings, our representations are just a visual mechanism for expressing our ideas. And when you care about your ideas, like really care about your ideas, it will come through and you will question how you're drawing. If I can make it personal for a moment, when I went to school, I don't know, I'm not going to throw Tara under the bus, but I'll say when I went to school, you didn't put yourself in your projects. You wouldn't. We can call that capitalist mentality, or the sort of muscled machoism of the times, or whatever it was. You had to remain distant. You could never be a vulnerable observer. And I believe that now that's what I meant by you can't just study climate change anymore. We're all experiencing it. It's personal. And so maybe it's also a moment to embrace other people's stories and talk about the heritage of the land and spend some time there and report back and think about it, and then open dialogue and be genuine to the moment, and slow down and take it in and see what kind of creative way you can show your ideas if you've cultivated that kind of care. And let me know, because I'd love to see it.
So I think we'll take one more question. Any from the audience? All right, I'm going to return back to the Q&A, and this will be a question from our Q&A audience. Sorry, it's jumping back to what you were talking about right before that last question. So this person asks, I'm curious about the relational structures that you observed in your research. For example, how are communities facilitating conversations for managed retreat? And did you observe consensus-based structures? I'm curious about how communities are working together outside of the FEMA framework.
Also a great question. It's a tough thing to, I guess it's a tough thing to say out loud, but I had a very hard time. My students and I was an MDes project in risk and resilience. And for many years, student researchers and I just started to put our heads together and try to figure this out. And we had a really hard time finding examples in continental America. There are examples in Alaska. Unless we looked to the deep past, where the regulatory frameworks were less loose, or where people had more freedom to make choices based on their relationship to the land rather than their real estate. And that was humbling for us. And so I don't have very good examples for you right now. And one of the reasons I wanted to do the book, and we made sure to do the book also as an online sort of exhibition, is there were all of these dossier cases, what we call the dossier, which is basically a list of cases we think are retreat cases, meaning they have the 4 conditions of retreat embedded in them. But after having visited the ones that we did, we also realized how much the cases change, of course, through firsthand experience, through idea making in place, through entering into a relationship with place. And so I hope that the list, this list, can be open source, so to speak, that people can start to respond and maybe add their experiences in their places. But examples of relational processes that went really well, I can think of many in Chile. Well, all 5 of them have really beautiful relational stories. In Chile, post-tsunami, in Constitución, where we were, it's outside of the capital, and they were very slow to receive any aid. And the community, I met with the community organizers, they've formed their own whole NGO now. They took it upon themselves to organize. They found a home that was in decent shape. They put up signs around the neighborhood. They said, come here for food and water and drink and care, and we will take care of you. And they organized so well that by the time the urban structures came in with all of their trucks full of bottled water and whatever else, they were turning them away. They were like, we don't want you here. We don't want your big truck. We don't want your bottled water. We've got this because we know each other. And it was all through word of mouth. Like, have you seen so-and-so? Because I know his uncle and he might be here. And they organized, they self-organized. And because of that self-organization that was built into the days following the disaster, they also got together to advocate together, as a constituency against the urban framework that was coming to them from Santiago, and said, we don't want to build back there. There's too much memory there. We do not want to build back. So figure out a way that all of these people whose houses were ruined can have a park instead, because we don't want to build back. And it was a very long, trying, and difficult process. I'm not trying to say it was as easy as that, but that's the gist of it. And they did it with each other. And they did it because they believed in it. But I hope in maybe looking through the book, you'll find more cases too, and then maybe look at how you can find relations in your projects, because they're everywhere and it's not just human to human.
Travis, who asked the question, said thank you. Well, Rosetta, I want to thank you very, very much about the conversation you brought to the table today. It certainly broadens our perspectives as designers, that we need to think not only about the structures that we're building, but also the rest of the material world that it's embedded in. And how crucial it is that we think of, that we include the animals and vegetables, minerals, and humans in the conversations. And with that, I think we will end our lecture. And again, we are very grateful that you joined us today.
Thank you so much. I wish I could have been there, but thank you. Such informative and inspiring questions.
All right. Thank you everyone for coming.